Tonight, we're going to open the archives on a chapter of history that, well, it stands completely alone. An event so cataclysmic, so utterly alien, that it just shattered the foundations of a world that was so confident in its own supremacy. What you're about to hear is not fiction. This is a historical account of the days when humanity was forced to look to the skies, not with wonder, but with absolute, paralyzing terror. This is the record of the Martian invasion. You know, it all began with a thought so completely outlandish that no one really even considered it. I mean, think about it. It was an age of empire, of steam power, of scientific certainty. Humanity was just going about its business, totally serene, completely sure of its place at the top of the food chain. The idea that they weren't the only intelligent life around, it just wasn't on the table. And they were so wrong. It was a profound, catastrophic error in judgment, one that would be paid for in fire and in blood. To really understand the shock of what happened, you have to first understand the calm. The world of the late 19th century was, well, it was a world of almost infinite complacency. People were just bustling about their little affairs, totally convinced of their dominion over the planet, giving absolutely no thought to the older worlds out there in space as, potential sources of danger. If they thought of them at all, it was with this sort of patronizing curiosity. And really, this massive gap in perspective is at the absolute heart of the conflict. For us, for humanity, Mars was just this distant red dot, a topic for academic debate. Maybe there were some lesser beings there ready to welcome what they called a missionary enterprise. But for the inhabitants of Mars, a planet that was cooling towards its end, a world where the oceans had shrunk, the air had thinned, Earth was something else entirely. Looking across that 35-million-mile gulf of space, they saw a morning star of hope. Our warmer planet, green with vegetation and crawling with what they could only see as inferior animals, was their last chance. It was an escape. And this, right here, is the truly terrifying reality of the whole situation. This wasn't some random act. It was a calculated, deliberate plan. And it was conceived by intellects that were vast, cool, and completely unsympathetic. These were minds that saw our entire bustling civilization the way we might see an anthill, a resource to be exploited, or just an obstacle to be cleared away. Their world was dying, and their only way out was to carry their war sunward, straight towards us. The signs were there, for anyone who had the instruments to see them. Back in 1894, a huge light was spotted on the planet's surface. We think now it was probably the casting of the enormous gun they were building to fire on us. And then, years later, the launches began. For 10 nights in a row, astronomers watched a jet of fire get squirted out from the planet, an unerring missile sent right across the void. But here on Earth, no one could even begin to comprehend what they were seeing. The papers made some passing notes about volcanoes on Mars, and all the while, those cylinders are getting closer, rushing at thousands of miles an hour, the swift and silent messengers of our doom. Okay, so this cosmic threat is about to become a very local reality. It all happens on a quiet piece of land in Surrey, England. Horsell Common, a simple place of heather and sand pits, was about to become the very first battlefield in a war for the entire planet. It didn't arrive with a declaration of war. It arrived as a spectacle. Hundreds of people saw it streak across the evening sky, this line of flame that most people just dismissed as an ordinary falling star. But this was no meteorite. It plunged into the common, gouged out an enormous pit, and set the ground on fire. The first shot in the War of the Worlds had officially been fired. An astronomer named Ogilvy was actually the first one to find it, right at dawn. And what he found lying in that pit defied any easy explanation. It was huge, perfectly cylindrical, and covered in this weird, ashy crust. But it was its shape, more than anything else, that suggested design. This wasn't just some random rock from space. This thing was manufactured. It was artificial. And throughout that day, the tension on the common just kept building. What started as a local curiosity quickly became a national sensation. By the afternoon, the evening papers in London were running these huge, startling headlines like "A message received from Mars." Crowds started flocking to the common just to stare at this silent object. And then, as the sun began to set, the silence was finally broken. A muffled, grating sound was heard. The circular top of the cylinder, like an enormous screw, was beginning to turn from the inside. At that very moment, everything changed.
All that scientific curiosity, all the idle speculation, it all just evaporated, and it was replaced by a primal, uncontrollable terror. The thing was opening. I mean, just try to imagine standing in that crowd, elbowing someone for a better view. The lid falls onto the gravel with this loud, ringing crash. You're staring into this black, circular hole. Everyone, and I mean everyone, expected to see a man emerge. Maybe someone who looked a little different from us, but, essentially a man. They had absolutely no frame of reference for what was about to come out. That was the first sign of life. Not a hand, not a face, but something utterly, completely alien. Tentacles, thin and gray, just coiling out of the darkness inside. A sudden chill just fell over the crowd. A woman shrieked. People started pushing their way back from the edge of the pit, astonishment turning to absolute horror on their faces. And then the creature itself started to emerge. A huge, rounded bulk, maybe the size of a bear, rose slowly and painfully out of the cylinder. It glistened like wet leather in the fading light. Two immense, dark eyes stared out, unblinking. A lipless mouth quivered, dropping saliva. The entire body just heaved and pulsed, struggling against the unfamiliar, crushing weight of Earth's gravity. So let's just break down what made these creatures so repulsive to the people who saw them. There was something almost fungoid about their oily skin. Then you had these gorgon-like tentacles, the incessant quivering of that V-shaped mouth, and the sheer intensity of those enormous eyes. It all just combined to create this feeling of profound nausea and dread. This wasn't just a different kind of life, it was a biological nightmare made real. Any hope for some kind of peaceful communication? Any lingering belief that these creatures might be benign? Well, it was about to be extinguished in a flash of invisible fire. The first act of the war was just moments away. Even in the face of this absolute horror, humanity made one last futile gesture of peace. A small group of men, including the astronomer Ogilvy, started to advance toward the pit, waving a white flag. It was this hasty, desperate attempt to establish some kind of communication, to show that they weren't just mere animals, that they were intelligent too. It was a gesture the Martians either didn't understand or simply did not care about. This was the only reply they got. 3 distinct puffs of bright green smoke drove up into the still air, and the sky seemed to darken in contrast. A faint hissing sound started, and it grew into a low hum, this long, droning noise. Then a humped shape rose up out of the pit, and from it, the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker into existence. What followed was just slaughter. An almost silent, blinding flash swept out from the pit right toward the deputation. It wasn't an explosion. It was as if some invisible jet of heat hit them and just flashed into white flame. Men were suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. They would just stagger and fall as this invisible sword of heat passed right over them. Pine trees and dry bushes burst into flame with a dull thud. It was a flaming death, sweeping steadily and unstoppably across the common. The cost was 40 lives. 40 people lay under the starlight that night, charred and distorted beyond any recognition. The first contact between worlds had ended in a massacre. The initial horror of the creatures themselves was about to be completely overshadowed by the terror of their technology. All through the night, the sound of hammering had been coming from the pit, and as storm clouds gathered overhead, the Martians finally unveiled their true engines of war. This was the sight that greeted anyone unlucky enough to be near Maybury Hill that night. Seen in the flashes of lightning, a monstrous tripod, impossibly tall, was striding across the landscape. It was a walking engine of glittering metal, smashing through entire pine trees as if they were just reeds. It was a vision of mechanical, unstoppable power that just defied all earthly experience. And what's so crucial to understand is that this was not just a vehicle. It moved with a terrifying life of its own. It had this ringing, metallic pace. It seemed to pick its road as it went. And most chilling of all, the brazen hood on top of it moved back and forth, with the unmistakable suggestion of a head, looking about, surveying the destruction it was causing, before raising its weapon to strike again. So this was the new reality. Humanity, the self-proclaimed lords of the world, were now as helpless as ants under a boot. Their soldiers, their guns, their entire civilization, it was all rendered obsolete in a single instant. How could a civilization so serene in its empire over matter possibly fight back against an enemy that wielded invisible swords of heat and strode upon legs of glittering metal. The true War of the Worlds had just begun.